Wabarakatuh, everyone. Inshallah, today we're going to continue the tafsir that we've been doing for quite a while. And the tafsir that we've been doing certainly was actually in Surah Al Maida. I know last time we were here, we kind of went into a lot of different figures. We talked about the ayah, so let's go back to that ayah. Could see all the scribblings on it. إِنَّا أَنزَلْنَا التَّوْرَاةَ فِيهَا هُدًى وَنُورٌ. Let's first go zoom out and actually go right to Surah Al Maida, and that is, let's say this is Surah Al Nisa, and we're going to go to Surah Al Maida, and definitely ayah 41 and 42. Here we go. So we're right there, of course, with the ayah. سماعون للكذب and أكالون للسحت. Okay, so when we're looking at that, hold on, we're just going to stop. Somebody is scribbling in our ayat, on our ayat, and let's actually, right there, hold on, how do you do this? Okay, all right. سماعون للكذب. So definitely was speaking about the Yahud and speaking about the munafiqeen as well. And we said that the Quran has the method in where it puts the different groups in categories and then talks about the behavior and what that behavior leads to. So we talked about how that combination, the Yahud and the munafiqeen being put together, it was because they were listening to the lies and listening and living a lifestyle of fakeness was actually leading them to just considering their own interest and not really live the principle. So they would eat haram money. And we said haram money, whether we're speaking about bribery or whether we're speaking about someone abusing their status or abusing their position, wealth position, or perhaps abusing their formal position in a government, or whether this person was abusing, I guess, the situation that they're in, whether it's power or whether it's I guess their ability to do something in where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was considering that as suht. So whether it's bribery or whether it's stealing or whether it's taking someone else's money in a slick way or whether it's in a powerful way, at the end, in where even when they would come forward as, of course, as Muslims, as the Prophet ﷺ, whenever they would come forward at the end, as Muslims, we would consider taking the principle over also over the interest, over the position, over perhaps, sometimes it can be that we might have a conflict of interest with something, but at the end, we have to rule. What was it? فَاحْكُمْ بَيْنَهُمْ بِالْقِسْطِ. We would have to rule in justice. We would have to consider that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's words are on top. وَإِن تُعْرِضْ عَنْهُمْ. Can we just turn away, not rule, and not worry about them harming us? But at the end, of course, if we were to rule, فَاحْكُمْ بَيْنَهُمْ بِالْقِسْطِ, then we have to rule in justice. For the Lord Almighty loves al-muqsitin. And of course, then the ayah continues, وَكَيْفَ يُحَكِّمُونَكَ. And we were talking about the story that was actually behind all of this. And two stories actually were there. The first story was the people of Bani Qurayza and Banu Nadir. So they were two Jewish tribes. We talked about them. We're just summarizing, everybody. There were groups of Bani Qurayza and Banu Nadir. Banu Nadir were considered an upper class. They were richer and certainly still a Jewish tribe. Banu Qurayza, on the other hand, were not necessarily not an upper class, but let's call them a middle class. So whenever any, let's say, assault happens from Banu Nadir on somebody from Banu Qurayza, Banu Nadir were always used to, I guess, compensating, not in capital punishment. And here we're talking about a situation where someone actually committed an assault where the rule by the Torah and by Islam is that it's supposed to be capital punishment because they might have killed somebody. Well, that's basically the rule. But of course, Banu Nadir, because they considered themselves as upper class, that's not how they did things. They considered that no, we were just always used to compensating in 100 wisq, which pretty much we're talking about bundles, huge bundles of dates. So we're talking about every bundle perhaps weighing maybe 100 kilograms of dates. That makes it what we're talking about, maybe almost 10 bundles of dates or 5 bundles of dates. And hey, what is that going to cost? But of course, Banu Nadir were considering themselves as upper class. You can't hold us accountable for any assault the same way that you would hold someone else. That's what they considered. So when they came in where they came to the Prophet ﷺ, and because the Prophet ﷺ was actually considered at that moment, was actually considered in the position of a chieftain in Medina. So they were coming to the Prophet ﷺ, but Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had actually exposed them and said, how would they really want to put you in a position to really rule on them when they have the Torah that actually displays and demonstrates what the ruling is supposed to be in regards to such assaults. But then they would turn their backs away on what? Well, on the ruling of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And then those are not the believers. In other words, they're not really believers in where they're not really in search of the ruling of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. What are they in search of? Well, they're really in search of a rule or what is actually in favor of what their interests are. In other words, and that's what we find a lot of times, in where you would see often people would come forward, let's say for a sheikh or an imam, hey, they got into some dispute. The imam would say, well, here's the ruling based on what I had studied, what we had studied in the Quran Sunnah, here's the ruling. Person A, definitely, the rule was probably not in their favor. And person B was definitely liking, I guess, the rule. So person A would then start basically going in ad hominem and start basically accusing the sheikh of probably, hey, not being educated enough, that's not what he basically did the study in. He starts basically going into ad hominem, attacking the person rather than basically being committed to the rule itself, starts attacking the person, starts accusing the person probably of lacking deen, that he did probably got bribed and all these things. Why? Because to him, you didn't rule in my favor. And that's the thing, in where you've got some Yahud that would act in the same way, in some Muslims that would act in the same way, and they would be, here we go, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is exposing the Yahud and saying, well, some Yahud, they would have the rule. Some Muslims as well, they would, or hypocrites, they would have the rule, but because it didn't rule in their favor, يَتَوَلَّوْنَ مِنْ بَعْدِ ذَلِكَ. They would just turn away, they would turn their backs, وَمَا أُولَٰئِكَ بِالْمُؤْمِنِينَ. And those are not the people that were considered as believers. Then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala right there says, well, إِنَّا أَنزَلْنَا التَّوْرَاةَ فِيهَا هُدًى وَنُورٌ. And that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had revealed the Torah. And of course, where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala right there, of course, exposes the Yahud and says, well, before there are certain people that are not looking for the guidance or the light. So for we had revealed the Torah with guidance and even light in it. And of course, those are metaphors, at least the one with the word light is a metaphor in order to say that it actually sheds that information. So when we're speaking about light, we're talking about guidance. We're talking about a way to let you identify right from wrong. Something that is giving you light is letting you see the darkness or the things that may look and appear murky, in where light is there to help you identify the perimeters of things, to help you identify, of course, where you're supposed to be going, to help you identify the borders, to help you identify where you're going, the destination, the purpose. That's what a light is supposed to be. So certainly that's what the prophets were ruling based on, which is the Torah. But who is really ruling on that? Well, الَّذِينَ أَسْلَمُوا, those that really submitted to the Lord Almighty, from those that are hadu, from those that were basically hadu, repenters, slash the Yahud were actually, it was referring to the Yahud, at least those that really truly repented, and those are Rabbaniyun. And we were actually going into this area. We still didn't get farther than this. We were talking about Rabbaniyun, who's a Rabbani, and that's what we were basically going into. So Rabbani, we said a person that is a Rabbani is basically a person that rules the people by knowledge. And plus, they would spend the time to teach them, but even on the small things in learning about the deen, to the things that are probably way more perhaps sophisticated. When we're speaking about small matters in the deen, we're speaking about where they're training them, even if we're speaking about adhkar, perhaps we're speaking about simple things about the religion, whether it's something small, something simple, something that might actually be seen by many people as not a big deal and not important, or let's say a detail, or even if we're speaking about major issues, perhaps about governance, perhaps about international law in Islam and all these different details, or perhaps even more detailed and we're intricate in terms of fiqh, usul fiqh, all these different things. So when we're speaking about a Rabbani, it can be a teacher that is teaching about maybe adhkar, can be teaching about commitment on the big details. And at the end, a Rabbani is a person that is a wise scholar, a person that is a jurist, a person that is embracing the words of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in action, in commitment, and in conviction. Al-hibr or al-habr. So why did we get to that word? Because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, well, who would be the ones to rule by the words of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? Well, they're basically one, al-Nabiyun, the prophets, الذين هادوا, al-Rabbaniyun, and now we're speaking about al-Ahbar. So who's al-Ahbar? Well, the word al-Ahbar is actually a plural. This is a plural. The singular of it is hibr or habr. But who is that? So that's basically a scholar. And the word actually comes from tahbir. The word, it goes back in its, let's call it, not necessarily the root, because the root is ha ba ra. So the root ha ba ra, in where what that conjugates into is tahbir, to actually mean to scribble, to scribe, and to perfect. You're talking about kind of like a parameter in where to scribble, to use ink, to scribe, all those areas in where at the end they would scribe the knowledge, they would basically let people learn it, they would clarify it to people, and certainly in where it is scribed, and certainly in where engraved. That's the word. Muhabbarun fi sudurihim. It is engraved deeply in their hearts. The knowledge goes out in where by the tongues they're speaking it, but it's actually engraved in their hearts. I had actually seen that in where you would have certain people in where they probably went into dementia, they probably lost their memory in many ways, but then some of that knowledge is engraved deeply in their hearts where they're just remembering it back again. They're remembering it, and they would even say words of hikmah. They would say words of knowledge. They would say words of wisdom, even though they really lost their memory. But they would still say things. And subhanallah, my uncle, even though he wasn't a person of ilm, he actually had glioblastoma, and that was just almost what was it? Almost a year and a half ago. And he was actually a man known for his generosity. And subhanallah, even when, of course, the glioblastoma was affecting the fluid in his brain, it was affecting his ability to walk, to do so many things. That cancer in the brain had grown so big that it basically eventually killed him. Couldn't move, couldn't do anything, couldn't even talk, couldn't. But those moments when he was capable of speaking, he would still speak of the same things that he was always used to saying, things of generosity. And he wasn't even capable of going out anywhere. And he would say, I'm inviting you to a restaurant. And I know that he can't even go to the bathroom. I'm going to invite you. Get ready. We're going to go to a restaurant. We're going to eat somewhere at a restaurant right now. And then he would say, you know what? I had a dream last night. I said, what was that dream? And he said, I dreamt that we were all going, and I went, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was introducing me to two Jannahs. And he was telling me that they're going to be mine. He's just speaking of Jannah and speaking of, even he was an ordinary man, not a scholar, a businessman, not a scholar, but subhanallah, what you do and what you live based on all these times in your life, your words are going to be repeating that on and again, even if you lost your memory, because it becomes your behavior, your lifestyle. It basically becomes inscribed in your chest. It basically becomes this behavior that comes in even when you're not conscious of it, the truth of what was happening inside. That's why you would see other people when they would probably be in a state of probably not in their complete consciousness. They would start swearing, using wrong words, and speaking of bad behavior, because the truth of what they were on the inside starts coming out to the surface. And you see that in where, the mind, even when it's not completely aware, it's really speaking of what's really in the core. What's in the heart starts coming out. What's in the mind starts coming out. What the true person of that person of when they were really living all their life and throughout their life, it would be easy to want to fake something when you truly are not, but because of a certain interest. But when that person is really revealing their true self, when, of course, they couldn't put in, let's say, their mind to bring about anything fake. That's where, when you're looking at muhabbarun fi sudurihim, you could see that what you really say and what you're constantly saying during those times of, I guess, the times that you were in your full alertness, you would see that it would start coming out to the surface while you're dying, while you're probably ill, and it would start to go out onto the surface. Subhanallah, I mean, and of course, Mujahid. We did actually talk about Mujahid ibn Jabr, and we went in details in terms of Mujahid, and he was a tabi'i. We talked about him, and he said that al-Rabbaniyun are actually better than al-Ahbar. They're actually at a higher level. Why? He said, when we're speaking about Rabbaniin, so we're talking about this word, is this person at a higher level than this person? Well, according to Mujahid, who is a tabi'i, and a great scholar, he said that those are actually at a higher rank than the ahbar. Why? Guess because they're putting in more conviction. They have the knowledge, but they have definitely that conviction that they were basically living in. And we talked about al-Jawhari, and we talked about that he was actually a scholar in Lugha Arabiya, and later, of course, went into some paranoia, and that led him to thinking that he could fly, goes out in a high place, and then jumps off from that high cliff and eventually dies. He's the second person to attempt flying, but certainly we couldn't necessarily be so proud of that because definitely there was a mental illness. We did talk about mental health and Islam and all of that. So just to, just remember that one. We also went in details with that. Okay, so let's focus this time. Al-Hibr and Al-Habr, and they were also, so Al-Jawhari said, well, they were actually the scholars, the rabbis that the Yahud, so الذين هادوا, the scholars actually had named for their scholars, they named them ahbar or habr for one. Well, that's because, of course, according to the Jewish law, that the Torah is so sacred that it's supposed to be scribed not using printers, but using hand. So they would scribe it in a way with using hand. So they become, of course, with the time, they become al-ahbar, the ones to scribe, the ones to actually write the Torah. And of course, it is until the time of today where these things would really cost a lot, and where they would still scribe it by hand. All right, let's see. And of course, Al-Farra, we did talk about Al-Farra. We talked about the great scholar Al-Farra and the reason or why they were called Ahbar, why that name was even there to really mean Hibr, which actually means ink. All right. And he said, well, he was called, and it was a description for a scholar to name him Hibr or Habr, which actually is the ink. But then later on, of course, it didn't necessarily mean ink per se, but it was actually referring to the scholars themselves, in where exactly the same way that in the Quran, when it said وَاسْأَلِ الْقَرْيَةَ, and ask the city. Well, certainly we don't talk to the city. We're not going to be speaking with the city, but that is actually omitted, in where the implication and what is really implied here is ask the people within the city. And that's the same thing. And when we're speaking about Hibr or Habr, it's not ink. We're not talking about ink here, but we're right now giving the implication that it's a person that's constantly using ink, which is the scholar and the person that is scribing. بما استحفظوا. I want to look at this one, in where what actually got them into this rank, what made them really rule by the Torah and be committed to it. Why weren't these people committed? Let's zoom out for a little bit, because of course Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was telling us in comparing these people that weren't committed, even though they really knew the ruling, and these people actually knew the ruling, and of course they took based on the huda and the nur, the guidance and the light. And of course, who was committed? Well, one, al-Nabiyun. And is this alladhina aslamu to describe al-Nabiyun? Those that had become, whether it's submitting to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, or whether it's to really embrace Islam, the religion of Islam, at the end, in where, of course, alladhina aslamu lilladhina. So here we go. Alladhina aslamu is not only speaking about the prophets, but it's also talking about each and every single one of these. So alladhina hadu were actually Muslim. Al-Rabbaniyun were actually Muslim. Al-Ahbar were also Muslim. But here's one thing. All these people, what actually made them stay in that commitment? Let's say Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, بِمَا اسْتُحْفِظُوا مِنْ كِتَابِ اللَّهِ وَكَانُوا عَلَيْهِ شُهَدَاء. So two things. That's two things. Let's put a plus right here to actually see one thing at a time. Why? Well, because this is letting us know. This is teaching us. This is telling us, well, here's one thing that's going to keep you hold on and be committed to the Huda and Nur, unlike the group that knew the rule but didn't actually take of it, didn't take much of it, didn't apply it, didn't live based on it. So let's look at the word first, بما استحفظوا من كتاب الله. Let's see. بما استحفظوا من كتاب الله. What does it actually mean? So the word استحفظوا in لغة عربية, let's actually look at that. Okay, we're going to write that word down. Here's the word استحفظوا. But here's one thing. In لغة عربية, I want you to look at this. There's the root حافظ. The root حافظ is basically taking you into one, the meaning itself, but the meaning, whenever, remember we said a general rule, الزيادة في المباني زيادة في المعاني. We always say this rule, and we say the general rule is that the word ziyada, the increase in the conjugation, is basically an increase in the meaning. So it's giving me something else. Okay, so the word حافظ, let's see what additions from the root حافظ. Here we go. Here's the word ha. Here's the word, let's use this one because we're going to be easier to actually assign it. Fi and the. What are the added words? What are the added letters? Let's put those in red. The added letters are the alif and the sin and the ta. Here we go. It's basically these, and plus the waw right there in the a. Those are the additions. Okay. So we know that this one is plural. That's pretty easy. This is for plural, indication for plural. So we're not going to talk about much. But what about the alif and the sin and the ta? Okay, that's the word. What about that? So the word حافظ actually means, let's look at it. The word حافظ actually means to, one, remember, okay, remember. Two, it could also mean to memorize. So it's all related to memorizing, all related to, let's say, in where a person is keeping track of something. But استحفظوا, you got two things to it. It's not استحفظوا, but it's استحفظوا. What's the difference? When you're talking about the alif sin ta, okay, just this alif sin ta, whenever you would have a word that starts with a, sin, and ta, the general meaning is that this is to seek something. استطعمهم, استطعموا, in where they seeked food. So whenever you would have the alif sin ta, they requested. So there's a request. But this one is not alif sin ta alone. This is alif sin ta and a dhamma. Okay, so what's the difference? So the difference is that there was let's say there was a higher authority of requesting something. Requesting what? You see, there's that when you're speaking about alif sin ta alone, then that means they're the ones that were seeking. But if it's alif sin ta and a dhamma, someone else was asking them to seek, to request. You see it? And we're looking at that, and who is that? So number one, استحفظوا, in where it's basically Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was ordering them to memorize, to remember and memorize what? استحفظوا من كتاب الله, from the words of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. What does that mean? How do you actually keep al-istihfaz? How do you actually stay committed to want to what? Memorize, remember. How do you memorize and remember? So استحفظوا من كتاب الله, it can mean that they were actually taking in the commitment, the effort to, one, literally memorize the words of the Lord Almighty. It could also mean that they were taking the time to be committed to we're not only speaking about memorizing to mean, going over the words and remembering them, although that's one form of hifz, but there's another form of hifz, which actually is a metaphorical hifz, preserving the words. So two types of hifz. There's the hifz, in where you're literally taking the time to really go over the words, repeat them on and on and on, repeat them to the point until you're capable of remembering what you just read. That's one type. The second type is to preserve something. To preserve something actually means to take in consideration the necessary means to preserve, to keep it safe from it being lost. But here's one thing. Of course, when we're speaking about preserving an item, let's say we're talking about fruits, there's a certain way to preserve fruits and vegetables, etc. But what we're preserving here is basically the words of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Preserving the words of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, how do you actually preserve those? Number one, you make sure, that's the highest level, in where you make sure that that is what's actually in authority. Number two is tuhfudu, you're preserving the words in where you're actually taking in consideration that these words are supposed to be a place of practice, a place of commitment. That's hifz, where you're preserving it as something that your heart keeps, your actions apply, and certainly your words would review and memorize. Let's do it again. Your actions apply, your heart preserves, your heart keeps track of, and certainly your words repeat. And we could add another one, your mind is also taking in as a perception. So how do we do that? Well, there's no way that your mind can take it as a perception of understanding if you're not learning. To learn is not enough to know the information, but you also have to take into another form in where hifz with your tongue. You have to repeat. And that's where dhikr comes in. Number three, in where your heart to actually make it not knowledge that your brain memorized and words that you were capable of repeating, you have to make it something that is, right, let's say, what is it? Engraved in your heart. Number four, it's not enough to engrave it in your heart, you got to put it into action. Now, if you actually look at that, you put those areas, look at this one. This one's beautiful. Look at this one. In where if you were to actually look at those ones, that's why, let's see, the Anbiya, how did they actually keep that hifz? Well, the Anbiya, they had the inspiration. Alladhina hadu, they basically had put it as a practice. Rabbaniyun, they had it into a conviction. Al-Ahbar, they had it in knowledge. Let's do it again. So what are we looking at here? We're speaking about those ones. They had it in spirit. Those ones, they had it in what? Well, they had it in a I guess, in different areas, more in action. And of course, we've got these ones, they had it in their heart and in their conviction, in practice. And these ones, they had it in their mind. So we talked about one. You've got the words, and you've got the words. You've got your mind, you've got your heart, and you've got the action. And here Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, بِمَا اسْتُحْفِظُوا مِنْ كِتَابِ اللَّهِ. So when, and if you want to be a person of commitment and really want to have that light and nur, you have to put in the effort to, one, learn al-mudarasa, to take the time to learn the tafsir, to learn the sunnah, to take the time to learn not only the small details and say, yeah, I know, it's basically asking me to be guided, that's it. No, taking the time to learn each and every single word, the conjugation, because each and every single word carries within it a lot of inspiration. And here's one thing. So one, استحفظوا, take in the time to learn. Two, take in the time to repeat the words, whether it's memorization or whether it's taking in the time to yourself probably teach it to others, repeat it, because repetition is one method that even when you look at the word dhikr can mean to repeat. The word dhikr can mean to say something, and the word dhikr could also mean to remember. Well, that's really going into the same word as istuhfiru. So you could see that sometimes the words in the Quran, they can use synonyms in where الحفظ and also الذكر. استحفظوا has a very similar word and a similar meaning as the word الذكر itself. So let's say, going back, how do I actually do it in my heart? Where you're actually sincere. You're sincere, you're leaving that ilm that's in your mind, and where you're sincere to be committed to it. Number four, putting it into action. You're not contradicting your behavior, because after all, that's what the Yahud were doing. They knew what the words were saying. They knew what the Torah was saying, but they didn't commit to it. Their actions spoke otherwise, even though they knew what the ilm was saying. They knew what the guidance and the words of inspiration were there to what they were supposed to be applying. Did they commit to it? They didn't. And they were, in fact, كانوا عليه شهداء. And they even had known, they had seen that in the Torah itself, it basically had the different prophecies about the Prophet ﷺ, and the different shuhada, in where they were also witnesses that one, the Prophet ﷺ had come as a prophet. Two, كانوا عليه, is this referring to the Torah, that it contained the huda and the nur, or is this referring to the Prophet ﷺ, that he had actually been prophesied in the Torah? فَلَا تَخْشَوُا النَّاسِ. Well, here's what happens. Of course, when we're speaking about being committed to the words, of course, many will actually want to fight you, because what they would want is really their interest taking place, and not necessarily the words of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, فَلَا تَخْشَوُا النَّاسِ. Don't fear people. وَخْشَوْنِ, and only fear the Lord Almighty. وَخْشَوْنِ وَلَا تَشْتَرُوا بِآيَاتِي ثَمَنًا قَلِيلًا. Let's go back to the tafsir right there. In where كانوا عليه شهداء, was it that the Quran and the Prophet ﷺ were coming from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, or is it that the Prophet ﷺ also had ruled based on what was in the Torah? So فَلَا تَخْشَوُا النَّاسِ, in where don't fear people, whether in exposing and revealing the different descriptions that were mentioned about the Prophet ﷺ, the different prophecies, or was it to expose what rule was actually mentioned in the Torah in regards to the incident that happened, whether we're speaking about stoning, or whether we're speaking about the different rules of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. I forgot, let me just pause for a minute here. I forgot to mention the other story that we had talked about before, which is for the two that had committed zina from the Yahud, when they had come forward to the Prophet ﷺ. We talked about the Bani Nadir and Bani Qurayza, when they had, I guess, committed the crime of killing. And what was the rule? The other one was two coming forward in where they had committed zina. What was the rule there? So we talked about those. What just wanted for those that just recently joined. All right, wakhshawni. And of course, when we're speaking about wakhshawni, in where, yes, certainly the words were directed at the Yahud, in where they had to fear Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But wait a minute, why not just do it like how the Christians would say, don't live in fear, but live in love for the Lord Almighty? Shouldn't we just say, love your Lord Almighty rather than fear your Lord Almighty? It's actually both. When you love the Lord Almighty, you would fear that if you would transgress the limits and you would go beyond the rulings and the principles of the Lord Almighty, that would actually that would affect you, that would come back in where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, if you transgress his limits, that you recognize that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will basically will punish you for it, because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, you recognize that he had created everything in an intricate detail, detail to the point that there is this magnificent design that if you were to go against it, are to go against Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And if you are to go against Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then this would actually come back at you. It will come back at you. There's no way that you can ruin the rules of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, well, whether what he had created in nature or whether he had created within your nature. So within your nature, or in nature, in the nature around you. In nature, we're talking about fitrah. In your nature, we're speaking about fitrah. And in nature, we're speaking about the life around you, whether we're speaking about social dynamics or whether we're speaking about the different things that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created around you in nature and all the different matter that you see in motion that surrounds you. Let's see. Is it necessarily just for Yahudin where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَلَا تَشْتَرُوا بِآيَاتِي ثَمَنًا قَلِيلًا? So yes, the words were directed at the Yahud, but it doesn't necessarily mean that we're also not included in this. In where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells even the Muslims, فَلَا تَخْشَوُا النَّاسِ. Don't fear people. Don't worry about what people will think of the way you're dressing or what people will think about the way that you behave in and all of that. Don't worry about what people think of you. فَلَا تَخْشَوُا النَّاسِ. Don't worry about people. وَخْشَوْنِي. And only fear the Lord Almighty. وَلَا تَشْتَرُوا بِآيَاتِي ثَمَنًا قَلِيلًا. And don't bring about a replacement of very little money in replacement for the words of the Lord Almighty. The back goes into al-matruk. So what did they really leave? What they had really left is the words of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the guidance. What did they take instead of that? Well, thamanan qalila, little pay. And at the end, in where al-ibra bi'umum al-lafzi la bikhusus al-sabab. What does that mean? Let's write it down. What does that mean? So when we're speaking about the words, I thought they were directed at the Yahud. In general, العبرة بعموم اللفظ لا بخصوص السبب. The general rule is that the theme is basically in the general wording within those words and not necessarily the particular incident that led to the happening or that led to the revelation for that ayah. So therefore, this isn't necessarily specifically to the Yahud. This is also directed at us as well. What does it mean? Where you're not taking in replacement of certain words of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and taking, of course, in replacement, getting some little money and little pay for, of course, ayat Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So this is two things. This is not talking about you going to a bookstore and seeing a Quran that's probably being sold, I don't know, for $90 and you start bargaining or you want it for something cheaper. Okay. This is not, and although some scholars actually said that that's what it means, that you're basically wanting to buy the words of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for cheaper money. Some scholars actually said that that's a form of it. But the real definition of لا تشتروا بآياتي ثمنا قليلا, in where we're speaking about the words themselves, how you're committed to it. So, for example, you recognize what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's ruling is, but that person because of a small interest, they're willing to give up on the words of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Because of a small pay, perhaps it would be that, hey, if you were, for perhaps this person works at some American company, okay? And right now they're talking about inclusivity and all of that. And this person, they were afraid that if they were to not use the pronouns that they were using, that they might actually stand out and not feel inclusive and lose their job, and all of that starts coming up and going to the surface, so they're afraid. What do? They basically lose their commitment in order to basically get thamanan qalila, very little money. And that money, no matter how big it was, at the end, it's not going to match whatsoever the reward of commitment that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would reward that person with, which is for the akhirah. وَمَنْ لَمْ يَحْكُمْ بِمَا أَنزَلَ اللَّهُ فَأُولَئِكَ هُمُ الْكَافِرُونَ. And whoever doesn't rule by the rule of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and what he had revealed, then those are the people that are al-kafirun. Then those are the people that are basically what? Those are disbelievers. But here's one thing. Let's look into here. So when you're looking at وَمَنْ لَمْ يَحْكُمْ بِمَا أَنزَلَ اللَّهُ, so does that mean that they're basically, in a general sense, does that mean that the ones that are kafir are basically the ones that rejected the Prophet ﷺ? Well, there's no doubt about that one. If a person rejected the Prophet or the Prophet ﷺ, there's no doubt that they are kafir. But is this necessarily going farther than that? In where if the person ruled by other than the rule of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, whether we're speaking about Muslims, Jews, or even, let's say, perhaps pagan, all right, and believing in where this is what should be applied, even though they recognize that that's not the rule of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that person is a kafir. Well, wait a minute. Does that mean if I were to apply the rules, let's put an example, okay? Let's just say we're talking about laws in America. We're talking about laws in America or laws in any country that you're living. There are different types of laws. Some laws, they are basically saying the same exact thing as Islam. Stealing is haram. Stealing is illegal. They agree with it. But then another law goes in complete contradiction with Islamic law. Let's give an example in where hijab is illegal in France, but hijab is obligatory in Islam. Do we apply the rule and the law that that country is basically considering, or do we apply the rule of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? Generally speaking, لا طاعة لمخلوق في معصية الخالق. Let's write it right there. لا طاعة, let's write it right there. لا طاعة لمخلوق في معصية الخالق. في معصية, and sorry about that, الخالق. Okay, we don't obey anybody if it is in going against the Creator. So no creature is to be obeyed in disobeying the creature. That's the general rule. لا طاعة لمخلوق في معصية الخالق. The Lord Almighty's law goes beyond all, and we would not whatsoever consider obeying anybody if it goes against the laws of the Creator himself. Okay, so that's the general rule. But here's one thing, is that if we're speaking about right now the Muslims in France, okay, let's take that as an example. If we're basically saying they're living in France, then certainly if they're not capable of applying Islam, then they have to find another country. If they can't maintain their Islam in a certain country, then they can't say, well, we had no choice, etc. Because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, أَلَمْ تَكُنْ أَرْضُ اللَّهِ وَاسِعَةً فَتُهَاجِرُوا فِيهَا. Wasn't the country and the earth of the Lord Almighty expansive enough for you to migrate in order to find a place to apply the words of the Lord Almighty? Then that's exactly what we need to do. Now, what if this person wasn't capable of doing so? They weren't capable of traveling, leaving the country, and they're stuck right there. Should we tell them not to go to school? Should we? Well, we'll basically say, well, at the end, what you would do is that ittaqullaha mastata'tum. Obey Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala as much as you can. So whether it's, I guess, wearing a hat, covering as much as you can, etc., because you definitely need a job, you definitely need to get into, let's say, into certain areas to probably work, to probably buy, etc., these different things, then in that situation, whenever you're capable of wearing your hijab, you're going to have to do it. Whenever you're not capable, well, dress as modestly as you can in order to maintain your deen as much as you can. What can you do? Can you perhaps, what does the law allow you to do? Are you able to wear a hat? Are you able to wear a scarf? Something, what are you capable of doing? So that's where taqwa. We're talking about those cases where they're not capable of leaving the country or applying it, etc.
Oh yeah, like China, right? Like some
or
of the
like China. Yep. And number 3, in where what if, let's say we're talking about wearing hijab, let's take it as example, in where it is, of course, considered illegal. And the general thing is that what you would see many Muslims saying, they would say, well, we're supposed to, by Islam, respect the law of the country that we're living in. Not if it goes against Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. If it goes against Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's rule is superior to all laws, period. Period. So no rule goes before and beyond Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. All right? So what if the person, what if the person was actually convinced that, yes, there's nothing wrong with taking off hijab, because after all, hijab, it's basically letting the women, I guess, lose their identity. It's basically getting them too hot. It's basically supposed to be something that was too traditional to wear. It's something during the time that suited them during that time period. But now people are more educated. They don't need hijab anymore. Right now, we've got the police officers to protect women's modesty. We don't need women to wear hijab. That's too traditional, too outdated. Right now, we could do things differently. If a person believes that, then that's معتقدا ذلك ومستحلا له, then that's a kafir. That person would be kafir. Even if they prayed and fasted Ramadan and they said, Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah, yes, that's kufr. That's a word of kufr to really believe that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's rules and rulings, regardless of which ruling that was, if it is part of what we know is in the text, then to believe that such words are outdated, or that they changed, or mock any ayah or any rule, then in that situation, that person had actually considered that they are beyond and above Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. All right? But if a person engages in that haram, and they know that it's haram, and they don't say that it's halal, then in that situation, that person is fasiq. What is a fasiq? A fasiq person is a person that is not committed to the words of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, displaying, going against the words of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. displaying it. They're actually displaying, not practicing the words of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Then in that situation, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would determine whether that person is going to be punished or whether that person is going to be forgiven. At the end, why are we going into this? In where if a person doesn't rule by the rule of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, look at the word, وَمَنْ لَمْ يَحْكُمْ بِمَا أَنزَلَ اللَّهُ فَأُولَٰئِكَ هُمُ الْكَافِرُونَ. Whoever doesn't rule by the rule of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then those are kafir. So the question is, if a person is not ruling in where they really believe that this was wrong, but they were committing a sin. They believe that that was a sin to not apply the words of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But if a person, all right, if a person لم يحكم بما أنزل الله, in general, they didn't rule by what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had ruled, and they basically wanted to pretend like al-kuffar, wanted to basically, hey, this is how we apply things. And in other words, let's say a lawyer, okay? Let's say a person studying to be a lawyer and later, of course, became a judge, and they basically ruled by other than the rule of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. They knew that that's not what the rule of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, but they say, well, that's what we could do right now. That's their law, and I'm basically just applying their law. Then according to this ayah, مَنْ لَمْ يَحْكُمْ بِمَا أَنزَلَ اللَّهُ فَأُولَٰئِكَ هُمُ الْكَافِرُونَ. If you're not capable of applying the rules of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then don't do it. If you cannot say the truth, then don't say what is false. If you don't have the ability to say the truth, don't say what's false, because then in that situation, you would be considered a kafir. And therefore, anybody that doesn't rule in what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had ruled in, then that person is kafir. And we're speaking about here. So how do we understand the situations right now in where we would see people ruling partially with the rules of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and others, they're not ruling by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? You would see in that situation, if the person was supporting and ruling by other than Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and actually has the authority to rule by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but they're actually not ruling by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and they're ruling by, let's say, secular laws in that situation, and they're capable. We're talking about governments here. That in that situation, that person would be supporting kufr. So therefore, the governments, the so-called Muslim governments, they're actually right now, there is no Muslim government on earth, period. Why? Well, because right now, you're seeing, of course, all these countries that are not taking Sharia as their place of governance. Even if they said, Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah, even if they're saying, Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah. Why? Because when you're speaking about it-tawheed is in 3 areas. Number 1, it's in, let's write it down. It-tawheed is in 3 areas. Let's look at it. Okay? Let's look at it. And where you got it-tawheed, which basically means, number 1, yes, we're believing in the Lord Almighty as an entity, as one entity. Number 2, we're believing in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala being the legislator, okay, as being the legislator. 2, in other words, of course, in worship. So worship is more comprehensive than just doing it in ritual, because worship is basically including in where what you live based on in your day-to-day life. And that's legislation. Number 3, in where you recognize, of course, the names and the descriptions. We're speaking about names, descriptions to actually be for the Lord Almighty, in where no one else shares those names and descriptions with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, because he surpasses all surpasses all, and where the Lord Almighty is Al-Malik. He is the King. He is Al-Khaliq. He is the Creator. He is the one that knows the past and the future. Alimul Allamul Ghuyub. He is the one that knows all the unseen. And the list goes on and on. And of course, we know that names and descriptions, names would describe the Lord Almighty's entity. The descriptions would describe the Lord Almighty's actions. Okay, the names would describe Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. He is Al-Wahid, that's describing an entity. He is one. Al-Wahid, one. The names would describe the Lord Almighty Himself. All right, but the description would describe His action. He is Al-Razzaq, that's describing His action. He gives provisions. He is Al-Khaliq, that describes an action that He does, which is creation. In other words, making a creation, creating something. Okay, that's a description, describing the action. Names to describe the entity Himself. All right, so in other words, if a person is actually to believe in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, it's not enough to believe in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but it's important to basically apply the rules of the Lord Almighty. Let's see. So are those necessarily, if a person actually believes in, let's say, secularism, as right now, hey, we're supposed to be inclusive, that's kufr. That's kufr to actually think that secularism replaces or surpasses Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's sharia. Feminism, all the different isms, communism, whatever it is, democracy. If you believed that any type of any system, that it surpasses the rules and the system of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that's kufr on the spot. No matter what system that was. No matter what system that was. At the end, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's system, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's laws, they surpass every single law. They're the laws that we turn to as Muslims and as ones that are committed to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. All right, so here we go. And where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, basically, is this necessarily just for the Yahud or for all? No, it's basically for the Yahud, certainly in this context, but it's for all within the general context. It's for every single person. Anybody that rules other than what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had ruled is going to be a kafir, whether within the context, within the words right here, whether it's the Hadu, Rabbaniyun, etc., anybody that rules out of the words of the Lord Almighty is going to be kafir. But there's a difference. Keep that in mind. If a person is one, not ruling because I guess their iman is weak. What does that mean? We're not talking about in a position of judgment. We're talking in a position of practice. This person, he knows that drinking is haram, but he goes and drinks. You ask him, this is haram. He says, I know, but I'm actually weak to apply it. I'm working on myself. That's not a kafir. That's a sinner. That's a fasiq. Okay? But if a person says that, no, there's nothing wrong with it, it actually is good for the economy, I'm actually trying to support the economy, and after all, guess what? A lot of the donations goes to the masajid anyways. We're building a lot of masajid. You know, in San Francisco, you got most of the Muslims, unfortunately, actually opening liquor stores, ironically. Liquor stores, yep. And the Islamic schools and the masajid are basically funded by the liquor stores. Ironically, Allahumma musta'an. Can the masajid actually take such donations? Differences of opinions between scholars. Okay? Differences of opinions between scholars. At the end, we're speaking about a situation that where a person might commit a sin, all right, and a person ruling by other than a rule of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So here's the thing. When we speak about ruling by the rule of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, there's different kinds. Number one, in where I've got a text, a direct text, and where it says this is what the rule is. And speaking of which, If you don't know what the rule is, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَلَا تَخْفُ مَا لَيْسَ لَكَ بِهِ عِلْمٍ. وَلَا تَخْفُ مَا لَيْسَ لَكَ بِهِ عِلْمٍ. And don't bring about any type of a stance or even a report or even a rule on something when you don't have a knowledge of. If you don't have knowledge of it, just say, I don't know. So not because they put you in a position to rule in something, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's a position of tashrif. It's not a position of tashrif, it's a position of taklif. It's a position of, when we're taklif, you're being held accountable for this. It's not a position of honor. The second, let's break that down. When we're speaking about that, it's basically taklif and not tashrif. Taklif and not tashrif. What is the difference? Taklif, it means it's a responsibility, okay? And tashrif actually means a place of honor. So many people would actually see it as, oh, I was actually given the honor to rule in this. If you don't have the ilm, it's not an honor. Just keep that in mind. It's actually responsibility where this is something you're going to be accountable for on Judgment Day. So therefore, if you don't have the ilm for it, we'll just say, I don't know. I'm not qualified to say or even rule in this matter. And this is very common in where people are willing to actually stand and just say that, hey, this is what I would want to rule in, when they don't even have the ilm for it. Okay, let's continue. And it was mentioned, of course, in where you got some scholars like Hudayfa ibn al-Yaman, when he was asked, is this for Bani Israel? And he said, yes, it is. But at the same time, he basically would, وَلَا تَسْلُكُنَّ سَبِيلَهُمْ حَذْوَ النَّعْلِ بِالنَّعْلِ. Or Hudayfa ibn al-Yaman, he said, yes, although it's referring to the Yahud, but the Muslims will take the path, حَذْوَ النَّعْلِ بِالنَّعْلِ. It's like saying, by taking each and every single step after them. And na'al is basically the shoe, in where you'll be stepping at their footsteps. The Muslims are going to be doing exactly just the Yahud, in where they will, one, it will start with, they would know the rule, but then they would apply something else. And two, where they would take a replacement for certain dunya interests rather than wanting to apply the rule of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And then level three, where they would rule by other than the rule of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, because what? They would rule by other than the rule of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, because to them, hey, I don't want to somehow go against the world. I don't want to go against the governance. I don't want to be portrayed by the media as if I'm backwards. I'm not ready for all of this. The list goes on and on. At the end, in where whoever rules other than the rule of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is basically a kafir right there. Let's see, in where here's one thing in where this one's rather interesting. Let me look at Tawus for a little bit. Tawus was also one scholar. He let's actually get him out in where, let's see if we can take a moment, and we're gonna let you see Tawus for a little bit. He's actually a very important scholar, and let's write it down right there. Tawus and Ibn Kaysan.
I have a question real fast.
Go ahead, Noura.
So are you saying that all the rulers now are kuffar?
All the rulers now are kuffar. So, here's one thing. Let's go over here. And that's why I'm actually talking about Tawus. So if you're talking about the rulers in where they're actually applying the rule of secularism and regarding it as the rule that supersedes and is superior to the rule of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the answer is yes. Is this what they would apply? The answer is yes. Then yes, they are. But here's one thing. You're going to find many of those, especially madkhali and all of those, they're going to go at you and say, look, this is a takfiri. This is not a takfiri. This is what the Quran is telling you right there. مَنْ لَمْ يَحْكُمْ بِمَا أَنزَلَ اللَّهُ فَأُولَئِكَ هُمُ الْكَافِرُونَ. You don't rule by the rule of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and you're in a position of authority to rule by the rule of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then you're a kafir. Simple as that. All right. So
Jazakallah khair.
all right, you're gonna find that some people coming at you, takfiri, takfiri, takfiri. Well, are you gonna say that the Quran is a takfiri too? Are you gonna call the Quran takfiri? No, the Quran itself is actually telling you that you don't rule by the rule of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That's the idea that you're supporting. That's the idea you're promoting. That's the idea that you're enhancing. That's the idea that you are enforcing. Sorry, but that's straightforward in where that's a kafir right there. All right, let's see. This is the first time that I hear sirens in Malaysia. I didn't even know they had one. Never heard sirens in Malaysia. I only hear them in America. You know, I only hear them in America, whether it's fire sirens or even ambulance or even police. And as we're living in Brooklyn Center, so we heard a lot of it. Okay. All right. So it is, let's say طاووس right there. He says, ليس بكفر ينقل عن الملة. طاووس, who's طاووس first of all? His name is طاووس ibn Kaysan. Hold on, let's just see his weight for a bit. Okay, let's see. We're going to go right there. Remember right there in where طاووس ibn Kaysan, he died 106-year hijrah. And let's just get some information about طاووس ibn Kaysan. By the way, this website right here was actually designed by a guy, an Egyptian guy. His name is Raghib al-Sirjani. Did an outstanding job, but I'm not going to go there. Anywhere, they did a really good job. I would definitely recommend it, especially if you want to, I guess, here we go. This is Raghib al-Sirjani right there, Islam story. Did an outstanding job in simplifying Islamic history, wrote all these beautiful articles about Islamic history. He's actually a urologist. We're talking about Raghib al-Sirjani. We're not talking about طاووس here. Okay, he's actually a urologist. He's still alive. And he has this special interest in speaking about Islamic history. And with, of course, a lot of donations, he was capable of making, of course, Islamic history available. And I know it does also have an area in English as well. I don't know how you can get to it, but find it. But it does actually have that in English as well. But of course, you know me, I like to go to the main resources. So we're going to go to the main resource, which is Sir A'lam al-Nubala. Let's look at it. طاووس was originally from Yemen. Okay, but here's one thing. In where he wasn't necessarily Yemeni to mean the Arabi Yemeni, he was Abu Abdurrahman al-Farisi. Now keep in mind, طاووس ibn Kaysan, when you say he's Farisi Persian, and what happened is that طاووس ibn Kaysan, he was not a free person. He was at least a mawla. He was mawla to mean that he was an ex-slave. Okay, let's say he was one of the children of the Persians who, of course, the Persian king had basically set in order to lay, of course, let's say, an army there, but then later on, he basically became a mawla. Let's look at more information then in where, right there, Ata ibn Abi Rabah, he basically said that Ibn Abbas said, I think طاووس is from the people of Jannah. He was actually known to being a person that was committed. And let's see, and where, let's go further and just learn some things. So we know now where we're just gonna, I'm trying to get to at least the most important thing. So let's see right there in where no one is أصدق لهجة من طاووس. There's nobody as honest as طاووس. طاووس was actually known. Now the word طاووس actually means peacock. But remember, they used to name people based on like Jundub ibn Junada, grasshopper, and they would name these names because it's to either reflect perhaps beauty or to reflect power or to reflect speed or to reflect different things that they had seen in animals or they had seen in things in nature. But, you know, we're not here looking at what their mother or their father had named him, but we're talking about his name, طاووس ibn Kaysan, in where he was a known scholar to actually be presented in a lot of the areas of ilm. In particular, we're speaking about fiqh and we're speaking about tafsir. So that was Tawus ibn Kaysan that you could actually read in, of course, whether we're speaking about Tawus ibn Kaysan, reading about him, of course, in this website, or even in the Islam story, or even speaking about it. So even if this comes in English, you could simply actually go to the translate, at least take it into the other Google Chrome, and then you could translate the whole thing. Okay. And just, keep that in mind. Okay, let's see. What did he actually say? So Tawus said, ليس بكفر ينقل عن المنة ولكنه كفر دون كفر. And Tawus had said, well, this is not a kufr that gets the person outside of faith. So now Noura, we're basically answering your question according to Tawus. He said it's
Oh,
not
good, because my mind is just like thinking and wondering about things.
Okay, hold on. So
Okay.
that's okay. So Tawus is saying, well, that's not necessarily a kufr that gets the person out of the faith, out of religion, but there are different stages to kufr. Different stages to kufr in where if the person is basically ruling and saying that this is from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then that situation, then that's kufr. If a person rules basically in hawa and ma'asiyah, they recognize that that's not the ruling of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but they're ruling really just based on hawa, just because, hey, it's just, I guess they're not applying the rules of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but it's basically that's a
Or maybe if they
sin.
don't know, they don't learn, right?
They don't know, they don't learn, or perhaps it's another form of a sin. Okay. So he's saying that if they recognize it, it's exactly like someone coming, let's say, to a person, a random person, and telling them, hey, what do you think about polygamy? Let's just say. And a woman said, well, this is supposed to be haram. It's oppressing women, it's abusing women, this is that. Then in that situation, okay, this would be kufr, because she regarded this as the right there where she considered and mocked the rules of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But if she said, well, I don't want my husband to get married to a second wife, and let's say she gets angry, let's just say took it to the extreme, okay, and said, you know what, because you got married to a second wife, I'm leaving this marriage and I'm this, and let's say in where she was, let's say, advocating against polygamy because she feels that, hey, it's abusing a lot of women, and let's just say that this is what she's doing. Is this kufr? According to Tawus, it's basically ruling based on hawa, it's basically ruling based on whims, and not necessarily regarding that her rules are superior to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Even though I find that really, um, I really find it really self-contradictory, but this is what, of course, Tawus is saying. He said it's a form of sin. But of course, majority of the scholars, they said, no, you go against Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then that's what you're applying. You're applying and you're inferring that your laws are fairer or more just and have better, let's say, ruling than Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And majority of scholars would consider that as kufr on the spot. But Tawus said, well, no, there's a difference. That's a form of sin and not necessarily kufr. In other words, this woman, for example, who said, hey, polygamy is basically causing a lot of harm. Yes, I know it's in the book of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but you could see our men are not equipped to knowing the rules. They don't have the deen. So therefore, I want to go against and stand against polygamy. And because most of our men are right now not applying the deen of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, although majority would consider that you still went against the rule of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that's kufr. Tawus would say, no, she's right there. This is kufr duna kufr. It's not the kufr in where she had left the fold of Islam, but it's really close to kufr, to really leaving the fold of Islam. But if she's basically presenting it that, no, I know that that's what the word of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is saying. I'm just saying that people are not committed, and therefore I'm standing against it because they're not applying it right. Then in that situation, this wouldn't necessarily make her a kafir to get out of the fold of Islam, but this would actually be a ma'asiyah. This would be a sin, according to Tawus. Okay, so here we go, everybody. Guess what? We just finished and completed the 7th juzu from Tafsir al-Qurtubi. Alhamdulillah. And I had already prepared the 8th juzu. And remember, Tafsir al-Qurtubi is 21 juzu. We're on the 8th volume. Okay? We're right now the 8th volume.
MashaAllah.
Yeah, mashallah, that's good. That's good. We actually discussed a lot of things. Let's just see what we're let's see right there. I wish we were together. We would have actually celebrated all of this. But we'll still celebrate virtually, inshallah. Okay, so the 8th, inshallah. So this is the 8th juzu right there. Let's see what's coming up in where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala وَكَتَبْنَا عَلَيْهِمْ فِيهَا أَنَّ النَّفْسَ بِالنَّفْسِ. We had كتبنا, we had basically revealed or decreed onto them that a soul for a soul, an eye for an eye, a nose for a nose, and an ear for an ear, a tooth for a tooth, and the different assaults or the different, I guess, الجروح, and where cuts, there's basically a different kind of a ruling on them. And whoever would forgive, then this would be an expiation on behalf of them. And whoever does not rule by the rule of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then those are the people that are zalimun. Those are the transgressors. So, of course, let's see right there. Here's the thing. Al-Qurtubi said there are 30 matters to discuss in this. We're not going to take all the 30 matters, but we will go over a lot. So you could see I've been really studying throughout this time. Okay. And you could see all those highlighted areas, and we're trying to, inshallah, go and see which ones are important for us to discuss. And hopefully we're not going to go for and discuss each and every single assault and what the ruling is, but at least, inshallah, we have to know what the scholars had actually mentioned, because we're here trying to learn. And remember this ayah in where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, بِمَا اسْتُحْفِظُوا مِنْ كِتَابِ اللَّهِ. We're actually trying to learn all the details that were mentioned in the book of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We're actually trying to know the rules. We're trying to apply the rules. We're definitely trying to repeat the rules. We're trying to create a vision, an action, and certainly an inspiration deep on the inside, in where we would see through the lens of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, through the lens of Quran and Sunnah, and not through the lens of our own hawa. So this is it. Subhanakallahumma bihamdik, nastaghfiruka wa natubu ilayk, nashhadu an la ilaha illa ant. If there are any questions, I'd be happy to listen to them, inshallah. Or even if you would like to unmute yourself, that's also okay too.
I just had one question, sorry.
Go ahead, Noor.
Yeah, because what you were saying about the rulers, does it like for the Sharia to be implemented, should there only be one Khalifa, or?
You know, one thing is that when we're speaking about Khalifa, does there have to be one Khalifa? Here's one thing, is that certainly when we speak about Islamic history, we're actually speaking about different times in where do we necessarily take Islamic history as the inspiration that we have to revive? The answer is no. We can have new circumstances with new situations. In
Okay.
other words, can we have, let's say, something similar to what the EU has, in where you have Muslim countries, and these Muslim countries, they apply Sharia, but then you would have somewhat of, I guess, not necessarily one Khalifa, but you would have, let's just assume we've got Oman has their own, I guess, leader, and let's say another one, because even Noura throughout Islamic history,
Yeah, I
if I
know
were
there's been times where there's been
the
different
Khalifa,
yeah.
Noura, the Khalifa himself, for many, many, many years, Khilafah technically ended during the time of during the time of the Dawla al-Abbasiyya, or in fact, even before that. Yes, it was called al-Khilafah al-Abbasiyya, but technically, the Khalifa wasn't even ruling. He was more of an inspiration. I mean, to the point, can you imagine that the Khalifa himself would actually seek help from a Salajiqa, which basically are the Kazakh, all right?
Mm, yeah.
Asking them, hey, help us from the Crusades, help us from the Mongols and all of that. They're asking help from the Kazakh and the Uzbek and all of that. Well, I thought you were the Khalifa. You're supposed to be the place of power. But those positions were more symbolic within history than an
Right. It's
actual.
kind of like today with Britain and the Queen, right?
They were more symbolic, Noura.
Yeah.
So that's one thing. In where many times when we're speaking about Khilafah, you could see, especially when we're speaking about, Hizb ut-Tahrir, they'd stand and say,
Yeah.
we need to bring Khilafah, we need to this and this. You have to keep in mind, I think sometimes they would have a very utopian imagination of what the Khilafah looked like, to be honest. Il-Khilafah doesn't necessarily mean that it was a place where everything was just going fine.
Right.
No, you had major things that were going on within al-Khilafah itself. Whether we're
Mhm.
speaking about, believe it or not, um, it's really sad to say this, but this is this is sad to say that there were even LGBT even within al Khilafah.
Really?
Yes,
Way back then?
way back then,
Oh
in
my
where
God.
poetry speaking about the kind of so-called literature to promote this kind of behavior was there. So this is not acceptable. This is definitely going against Islam, but
Yeah.
I'm not saying that the Khilafah is not something that we should work towards. If we can get the Khalifa, well, great. Let's work towards that. But to actually think that hey, we just want Al Khilafah, just work towards Al Khilafah, go ahead and work towards that. Why not? Definitely.
Because
Um,
Islam, I mean, has spread all the whole world,
Well,
subhanAllah.
I mean,
Like,
here, of course, Nora, but there has to be
yeah.
some form of governance. But what
Yeah.
I'm trying to say is that our focus on wanting the Khilafah, I'm not saying that this is not, if you mean by Khilafah to mean governance, to mean Muslim governance, then every Muslim is supposed to work towards that.
Right.
To have a Muslim body to govern by Islam, every Muslim is supposed to work towards that. Okay. But
Mhm.
does that mean that it has to be in the form of Khilafah in where like al-Khilaf al-Rashida, if you mean by like al-Khilaf al-Rashida, where there's only one person that is named al-Khalifa, al-Muntasir, al-Mu'tasim, whatever it is, and that every Muslim is supposed to be pledging to that person, then the
That would be
answer
really
is,
hard because
well,
there's so many
right. So,
countries and the land and right, so many different
here's
cultures
one
and
thing.
yeah.
Here, what I'm trying to say is that is this the only form of governance that where it has to be one person that's ruling on everybody, and therefore that's the only form of an Islamic system? The answer is it doesn't have to be like that. Even
Okay.
when you look at, can we have like different, let's say a federal system, let's say, in where we can have, let's say Malaysia having its own king, and let's say Indonesia having its own king, but then they work together, they're forming, I guess, one Bahasa kingdom or one Bahasa governance. Even when you talk about Malaysia, for example, they have 9 kings, I believe it was. 9 kings, and they would rotate on who's going to be king next, and every single, I guess, every single time frame a new king comes in. Can we actually have different or something that is similar to the EU, for example, in where, yes, every country has its own laws. And let's say we're talking about Sharia, but every single country has its own borders, has its own area, has its own, certain governance, and
But
its
working together, Yani.
distributing its wealth, etc. Certain, let's just call it a body of governance. They apply Sharia.
Right.
They apply, of course, the EU is generally applying, of course, secular laws, but of course the secular laws that you would find in UK are different than the secular laws that you would find in France, that you would
Yeah, that's
probably,
true.
yeah,
Yeah.
or that you would find in perhaps even in the US. You look at the United States of America, the laws that are perhaps in relating in some matters in California are different than the laws in Texas. Okay.
Yeah, subhanAllah.
And of course, it's not that I'm taking the American or even the EU as an example, but is this something that even Muslims can somehow create perhaps a unity in where, yes, we can have Pakistan along with Bangladesh, along with probably Kazakhstan, Afghanistan, create some, let's say, an Asian Asian Muslim body to protect them perhaps from the Indian, Chinese threats, for example. So they're creating their own bodies in where, hey, Afghanistan, you've got perhaps the land, and I'm just here hypothetically speaking, and let's say Kazakhstan, you've got the resources there, and you're giving the resources, and the other person is probably, or the other country, sorry, is probably giving us perhaps the water, and therefore we could create some form of a coalition that is based on different interests. We're not necessarily one government / one Khalifa, but we're, I guess, some form of interest, but these interests are probably what united us in making one body, kind of like the EU. It's they
Right.
they were actually fighting for a very long time. But then, of course, that interest to form an EU, and where the interest to form one body, in where they, even though they speak different languages, they have definitely even some religious differences. They're secular at the end.
Hey, if they can do it, we can
But
do it.
of course, as Muslims, we actually, exactly, as Muslims, we actually have a lot more, let's say, a lot more that unites us than what divides us. And I think so many times we're focused on what divides us than what unites us. Alhamdulillah, I mean, you never know, by the way, just like the Arab or the so-called Arab Spring and the Arab Spring, and how all of a sudden things change. You never know when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would actually bring about the change. But of course, dictators don't bring freedom because they don't care about people's freedoms. They don't care
No,
about justice. So we still
no.
have to figure out We still have to figure out on how we're supposed to be letting those that are ruled by these dictators recognize that these dictators can never be their place of freedom. So we have to
Yeah,
work towards
that's the
that.
first steps.
That's the first step, right?
Alhamdulillah.
That's the
Jazakallah
first step.
khair.
And we're
Jazakallah.
free ourselves from these dictators. And then, of course, creating a body with other Muslims. And it doesn't have to be one khilafah in the name of khilafah, right? But because even when you look at it, Dawlat al-Mamalik, it wasn't khalifa, okay? It wasn't really a khalifa. Same thing with Dawla al-Uthmaniyya. It wasn't a khalifa because a khalifa is supposed to be Qurashi. Okay, there were, and of course, even when you talk about Dawla al-Ayyubiyya, you talk about all these different Islamic governance throughout history. Even when they had pledged to al-Khalifa al-Abbasi, was more symbolic than anything else. So the Khalifa was really just a figure that people somehow wanted to unite around, but the Khalifa didn't even have the power to protect his own castle, let alone protect the government or even protect his people. Okay, so just an idea in where I think to speak about al-Khilafah as if it's a place where, yes, if only we had al-Khilafah, all our matters would actually be solved, but that's actually too utopian. Even during the time of al-Khilafah, you had a lot of things, a lot of corruption. A lot of corruption. I mean, can you imagine when you're speaking about, Islamic governance in where during Khilafah al-Uthmaniyya, if somebody goes into power, all of his brothers and sisters, even babies, were killed.
Oh, yeah.
Is that a ruling by
That's not
Islam?
Islamic at all.
That's not Islamic at all.
No.
That's not Islamic at all. So just to imagine that, yes, we just have to work towards this body called al-Khilafah. I would say that's a very shallow imagination, too utopian, I would say, of what a Khilafah looks like. You read the poetry, you read the information about what used to happen in Islamic countries, you would be the least to say, appalled to really knowing that this was actually happening in Muslim countries. So yes, not because
Inshallah, in the future, maybe we can have a course, Islamic
of course,
history.
but
Yeah.
what I'm trying, I guess, to infer, Noura, is don't think that a khilafah or a Muslim country was speaking of saints walking on street. Okay, that's what I wanted to infer. That you have to create your khilafah first within you, within your household, and that's what you have to work towards, and not necessarily feel that the khilafah is going to be this governance that is going to be changing everybody and making them saints walking on streets. Not even the khilafah. And certainly, in Allah la yaz'u bis-sultani ma la yaz'u bil-Quran. There's no doubt that governance itself has the power to basically enforce a lot of commitment that people might not actually have. But you want to keep in mind that the khilafah itself, aqimu ad-dawla fi nufusikum. First, you have to make the khilafah be within yourselves before you actually start thinking that, yes, I'm just supposed to be working towards one political rule and that's what's going to solve all the matters. Even if you're in a khilafah, you would still have to do da'wah. You're still going to find people doing what you're finding people doing in secular countries. So, in other words, work towards perfecting your deen and work towards, yes, definitely giving that da'wah to others and making the rules of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala be something that would be applied on ground, and you will see it as an autonomy working at a political level and a governance. Did I answer that one, Noura?
MashaAllah, tabarakallah. Yes.
ربي يحفظك يا ربي. And it's really sad. There was like a 22-minute lecture that Yasser al-Qadi was actually talking about al-Khilafah, and you had many people
Yeah, I
storm
saw that video. Yeah.
it. You know, I would say what he said was actually right,
Yeah.
but I think the Muslims are really shallow in their understanding of Islamic history,
Oh, yeah.
and they're
I mean,
really
even in countries like Syria and all these countries, I mean,
well, here's one
the
thing.
the
Like,
history has been distorted, or they're not even learning it.
I mean,
The
the
Islamic
history,
history.
certainly there is a lot of distortion, but at the same time, there's also, at the same time, you're talking a lot about, I guess sometimes we're imagining al-Khilafah as the perfect place. This is not to say that we don't need a Khilafah. There's no doubt that Khilafah is supposed to be something that we work towards. There's no doubt. But what I'm saying is that to imagine that il-Khilafah is going to be this magic wand that's going to purify everything is not actually accurate.
Yes.
That's what I'm saying. In where to imagine that throughout Islamic history that we were just these angels walking on earth is not necessarily true. And to imagine that, yes, they were just these evil people that were forcing people to abide by Islam by the sword is also not true. But at the end, you will see some people actually feeling that, no, attacking al-Khilafah, and you've got some like Hizb ut-Tahrir that will consider that al-Khilafah is the answer to all our problems, etc., is not necessarily completely true. And to make Khilafah become like as if it's an issue of this is our place of Tawheed is also not true. We've got a lot of things to work on in where educating the Muslims is one side. If you're capable of going and bringing al-Khilafah, well, go ahead and do it. But if
Get the ilm first.
well, I mean, at the end, I would say, hey, Hizb ut-Tahrir, do you want to work towards that end? Well, we'd love to see how you're basically waiting for this Khalifa to get out of Sirdab, exactly like the Shia would want, al-Mahdi to come out somewhere from a hidden cave, etc. Well, that doesn't make sense. But
Yeah.
in order to make the circumstances that would bring in the Khalifa, would actually mean we would really need to educate the Muslims on their Tawheed. We would need to educate the Muslims on ABCs of learning their Islam. And I would not undermine perhaps what one group of people that says, well, we're going to let people go to their Tawheed first. That's a great start. Go ahead. And other people, no, we need to work on people's tazkiyah. They know Tawheed, but we need to work on people's tazkiyah. You know what? Work towards that. Great job. Other people would
Just
say, no,
go towards Islam.
well, I mean, at the end of the day, each one has their, I guess, their vision of how we can make this possible. Well, good.
Yeah.
Go and work towards it. If you think by educating people about Khilafah and the way that we would govern about Khilafah, go ahead. Just educate people about their Islam and you live it in action rather than trying to somehow destruct other people's jobs and trying to undermine people's work and trying to do all that attack.
SubhanAllah.
It's subhanallah. So this is it. Inshallah, subhanakallahumma bihamdik nastaghfiruka wa natubu ilayk. Nashhadu an la ilaha illa ant.
Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum assalam.